Hello, everyone. Today we are talking about your long run, the long runs that you need to smash your Two Oceans half marathon coming up in 10 weeks' time. I, as always, have my colleague and friend Dev with me. Dev, how's it going?
Hey Sean, yeah, good to be back. Looking forward to the next one. We're getting into the swing of these podcasts now.
We really are, and maybe just to mention to everyone, last week we spoke about 12 weeks to race day. I'm going to put it down to my brain hasn't kick-started in 2025 yet. It was actually 11 weeks last week, and now we're on 10 weeks. Okay, so just apologies about that, but at the end of the day, this is why we've got Dev with us here, because there's no need to panic, and we're going to go through all of this with you. And as always, hold your hand over the next 10 weeks to get you to either your first half marathon or perhaps a PB at your next half marathon. So yeah, so Dev, let's dive straight in, right? So 10 weeks to go. Last week we spoke around this 4-week block where we're focusing on an endurance or aerobic capacity sort of aspects. We're still in that right now? Hey, this is what people should be focusing on now.
Yeah, exactly. So not too much changes in terms of the kind of stuff. So the only thing that's really changing in each of the 4-week blocks, but we're obviously now referring to the first 4-week block. The only thing really now that changes is us building on our volume. So the easy runs will get a little bit longer. The long runs in particular, and that's a big focus on today's episode, is focusing on that long run. So we're gradually building the volume and the duration of that long run. Now, it really is important that I kind of really want to put an exclamation mark or an asterisk here, that when we're talking about the long run, again, don't start panicking and thinking, especially if it's your first half marathon, that you need to be doing half marathon distances every weekend and you're making these massive jumps in terms of long run and how long you're spending on the legs. It needs to be, especially if you're a novice and you're building to this distance for the first time, it needs to be a slow, gradual build. The slower you can build up, the longer lasting those benefits actually are. If you make massive jumps too quickly, week in and week out, you are at really high risk of injury in a case like this. And that then just last week we spoke about consistency. That just throws the consistency out the window if you're getting injured and you're losing 2 or 3 weeks of training because you've strained something because you're trying to jump too quickly. So the long runs is where we are focusing now. This is a really good time for us to be gradually building that up. We're nowhere near the peak of our long runs. That's still to come later on in the plan. But it's now the stages where we are stepping them up and gradually building that up. And that might change. I mean, again, depending on what level of runner you're at, it might be 5 to 10 minute increments every week. Some will jump 10 to 15 minutes, maybe even 20 minutes every week. But that really is going to be dependent on the level of runner you're at.
Yeah, and yeah, where you've come from for sure.
Yeah.
So I'm so glad you mentioned that around the peak, right? And guys, just stay tuned because we are going to dive into how long your longest run should be later on in the plan. So yeah, stick around for that. Dev, I know a lot of runners, and I mean I do it as well. We and in South Africa we're so spoiled for choice with the number of races that we have week in and week out. I mean, my international friends and international clients, they don't have as many races as we have. So should we be taking advantage of that? Should we be using these races for our long runs? How can we use those? Should we?
Yeah, so I'm definitely not opposed to it. It's something I employ in my training. I like to say it takes the thinking out of it. I don't have to plan a route. I don't have to plan water stops and water tables. There's all of that in the races. So we do have the luxury. However, again, a big exclamation mark from my side is those aren't, as much as it's called a race, you are not racing it. I'm not expecting you to go out every weekend and enter a 10K or a 21 and push for the best possible time and try and run your PBs here. You are trying to run your first 21 or a PB at Oceans in 10 weeks time. So these runs are ways for you to get out, run different routes without having to think about planning routes. There's water tables, so it's a really good way for us to be playing around with when and how to take things in, implementing walk breaks, and just having that social aspect. Very often it's so much easier to run in an environment when everyone else is suffering around you, rather than you doing it alone and getting bored. Because it's also really easy to either not wake up in the morning and go and do it, or just to go, you know what, I'm done after 5Ks and I'm going home. So yeah, I've really got no problem with you running it, but it's really important that it's done easy and also still in adherence to what the prescription of the plan is. So again, if your long run for today, for example, is scheduled to be an hour, 20-minute run, don't go and do a half marathon distance if you're typically a 2-hour half marathoner, because then again, that long run, there's that massive jump in the long run that you don't need to be doing. You can go and enter a 10K and go and do that and maybe tack on 2 or 3Ks onto it if you need to. Or the flip side is go and enter a half marathon, and when you get to 15Ks, if that's the end of your prescribed time, pull out. There's really no issues with that. I know South Africans in particular and runners, we really don't like doing that. We want that medal. We've paid for that medal and we want it at the end of the day. But yeah, just you're working towards a bigger goal here. And especially if this is your first half marathon that you're working towards, you definitely don't need to be running a half marathon every weekend. So again, just kind of make everything fall in place with what the prescription of your training plan is. You need to meet the demands of what's required on that training session.
I love that. Yeah. And I'm so glad you said that. So you don't need to be running a half marathon in every single one of these runs already, right? And we see so many people do that. And one of the other big mistakes we see people making in their long runs in particular is that they think that they need to be doing those long runs at race pace, essentially. So running them as hard as they can. I don't know. So I guess it comes, I don't know, from school days of, harder is better, no pain, no gain, how what paces should we be running these long runs at? And how do you know that you're running at the correct paces?
Yeah, so getting that right, the sort of first thing I always like to talk about is a perceived effort. So for me, default measure of intensity always has to be perceived effort. And by perceived effort, I'm talking about what does that run feel like? How easy is it? Can you breathe quite easily, or are you gasping for air, struggling to get through? If you're doing an hour 10, hour 15-minute run and you finish that run, you should be able to go, you know what, I think I could probably add on another 15 to 20 minutes if I had to. That's generally a good indication that you have gone out easy enough and you felt like that run was easy enough. If you are running in the last 10 minutes, you just can't wait for this run to end, you're really suffering, you feel like you're bleeding through your eyeballs, and you really, if someone had to ask you to tack on another 5 minutes or 10 minutes onto that, you just want to go crazy. That's an indication that you've probably run that run way too hard. And I know we had spoken about it last week with recovery. It just means your recovery takes that much longer now before the next training session because you have pushed yourself a little bit too hard. Those of us that are out there that are using Garmin devices or any kind of devices for that measure, and like numbers, there's ways of us to calculate, or ways to calculate we like to use threshold and threshold pace. And easy runs, we generally recommend your easy run should be about 75 to pushing 85, probably even around 80% of threshold. Your longer runs will overlap a little bit, so down to 70%, so slightly slower, 70 to 82%. And then your recovery runs are really slow. So your recovery runs are 65 to 75% of threshold. Now, a very common question we get is, I can't run that slow. That's impossible. It's really important. One, that's where we're developing this aerobic capacity that we need to be running anything longer than a K and a half, really. We need an aerobic capacity. So that's really important. But it is also critical for us to just make sure that these numbers help us keep in a range and regulate what we are doing. Now, we do often, and you'll see in any plans that we've written, there's a pace range, or a zone, if you'd like to call it that. And those ranges can be quite big. The reason there is day to day, easy, if we talk about that perceived effort that I mentioned again, perceived effort, if I say today I'm going out on an easy run and my easy run might be 6 minutes 30 a kilometer, tomorrow I'll go out on an easy run and it might be 7 minutes a kilometer. the same perceived effort, but the pace changes. And that's down to work stress, life stress, how much sleep you had the night before. There's so much that affects how we feel on a day-to-day basis in our runs. And hence the reason we've put a range and a pace range to work according to.
Okay.
You are getting the same benefits whether you're running at the faster end or the slower end of that pace range. From a physiological point of view, you're getting exactly the same benefits out. But the faster end, you are putting yourself through a little bit more strain on the body. So it takes you that much longer to recover from than what it would if you were running at the slower end of that pace range. Still getting the same benefits, but much less demand on the body. So you recover a lot quicker from those type of sessions.
Okay. Yeah. So a lot to sort of take in there. I think key aspects, guys, is that you don't need to be bleeding from your eyeballs in your long runs. Okay. I think that's the first key point that Dev's going through there is that they shouldn't feel that hard. You shouldn't, because if you're pushing that hard in your easy runs, you're not going to be recovering quickly enough for your harder runs, which is actually what we want you to hit really, really hard. And we'll dive into those in a couple more weeks. But and Dev speaks around threshold and utilizing 75% of threshold, and Dev will dive into how to work that out. But what if you don't own a Garmin watch? What if you you don't use that, you don't like metrics, you're old school? How do you know then that you're running easy enough?
Yeah, so, and that's very common. Many people, especially if you are a novice, and this is, for example, maybe your first half, a lot of people don't have those devices and couldn't actually care less. They're out to have fun. I mentioned the perceived effort. So the perceived effort, firstly, is how are you feeling in that? But a really simple tool we like to use here at Coach Parry is we talk about the talk test, or the sing test. Not that anyone would want to hear my singing voice, but a talk test is if you are running with some running mates, you should be able to have a conversation, and a proper conversation with them, and not gasping for air between every single word. If you can't have a conversation, that's generally a good indication that you are just pushing yourself a little bit too hard, and just slow the pace down so that you guys can have a fat chat. That's a really simple way of measuring intensity, if you want to put it there. And I talk about like slowing it down. Don't be scared of using walk breaks. It's a really good way, and we've seen it time and time again with the clients we coach. The easiest way to get people to slow down is to throw some walk breaks into that session. And you practice that, put them into your long runs. That's something you will employ on race day as well. So part of your race strategy will include some walk breaks. So it's a really good opportunity to start getting used to that, practice those walk breaks. You're not failing. You're not a failure by putting in any walk breaks. I know, again, sort of old school mentality is if you can't run the whole distance, you've failed. That's not what it's about. It's one way of managing effort, one way of managing the load on the legs so you can sustain an effort for a lot longer as well. So that's really important, and a really simple tool for us to be able to just regulate the effort we are putting in. Just sort of one point you mentioned, or a good phrase, don't chase pace.
Yeah.
When we're talking about those easy runs, it is really important as well. We don't all run on perfectly flat terrain. So if you're running any sort of rolling hills or hilly type of routes, it is important to slow your pace down further to still have the same perceived effort. Obviously, naturally, when you're running on a downhill, you'll naturally be a little bit faster than a prescribed pace for the same perceived effort. So I always go back. Default must be perceived effort. And then things like heart rate and pace is the metrics that you look at to make sure that those are in the right zone or in the right areas. But don't try and stick to one particular pace when the terrain changes. You have to regulate it appropriately.
Yeah, I love that. And the walk breaks thing is so key. And I don't think it's just a South African mentality is running. I think it's international, but around, if you walk, like you say, it's a failure. I like to tell my clients as well that walking isn't a weakness. It's your superpower, and so see it that way. And I think also, this idea of, oh, well, I'm just doing the half marathon, so I don't actually need to walk, I think is also something that we need to get away from, because again, I think it's such a powerful tool to use. And I'm sure this is going to be a recurring theme. I know you and I hate the talk of, oh, well, I'm just doing a 10K. It's still 10Ks, still a half marathon. You're still
Yeah.
getting that done. So let's just change that sort of narrative a little bit as well. So yeah, Dev, I love all of that. Let's get into a little bit of the physiology or the nitty gritties for those who are data mad and love their watches and want to use Threshold. I mean, Garmin and everything obviously works out Threshold. How do you like to work out Threshold? What do you think is the best way to do that?
If you're over 50 and want to recover from sessions faster, run pain and injury free, and improve your endurance, then be sure to join Lindsay and I for our upcoming Faster Beyond 50 Masterclass. In it, we'll show you how we helped a 70-year-old run a 47-minute, 18-second 10K and how you can take those exact same principles and apply them in your training. Simply scan the QR code that's on screen right now or click on the link in the description below to save your seat in the training now. We look forward to seeing you there.
Yeah, look, there are several ways of doing it. Things like your training devices use different algorithms. So it's different algorithms at certain heart rates for certain durations. Again, if the measurements of those heart rates aren't correct, then the algorithm is thrown off slightly. So I generally don't like to rely on what your device says. A very simple, call it a field test, that we like to use is a time trial. Now, the easiest way to determine threshold through a time trial is just to go and run a 5K time trial. That obviously does vary, again, depending on the level of runner you're at. So if you are a runner who runs a 5K in 20 minutes, for example, it's not completely accurate, or there needs to be a little bit more of an adjustment around what threshold is. Threshold, ultimately, we like to use a 30 to 40 minute range. So what is the highest effort or fastest pace you can sustain for a 30 to 40 minute effort? We use that. So if, for example, you're a 30-minute 5K runner and you run a 5K time trial, and that's your all-out effort as hard as you can go, that average pace is generally a pretty good indicator of what your threshold pace is. I mentioned earlier then percentages of threshold, so that's then how you would calculate what your easy run is. So your easy run, or call it zone 2, will be a 75 to 85% of that threshold time. So that's how you would go ahead and calculate it. Again, like I said, there generally can be a little bit of manipulation and tweaking around depending on the level of runner you're at, but a good 30 to 40 minute effort is a good indicator or a good estimate of threshold.
I love that. Dev, can we just go back a step just around, you mentioned around the reliability of the data that we're getting, right? So I mean, all of these devices now have wrist-based heart rate. So if you want to use threshold heart rate, I have this constant conversation with people around how they're getting their heart rate from their wrist base. I mean, we know that's not accurate, right? But people want to argue with us all the time about that. Yeah, you give me your thoughts on that, please.
Yeah, so look, we've seen it. We've done a couple of, I won't say scientific studies around them, but we've done a couple of field type tests around it. We see it with our clients' data. We see it with our own data. If you're using the wrist-based unit for heart rate, I'm happy if that's the only measure you have and you comparing apples to apples over and over again. But there generally is a difference, and a fairly significant difference, in using wrist-based heart rate to using a chest strap. A chest strap is still always going to be, call it gold standard for measuring heart rate in any sort of activity. The minute you start relying on an elliptical sensor, so the little sensor at the back of your watch, firstly, there's distance from your heart to where that watch is sitting now. Your watch doesn't always sit perfectly on your wrist, so there's quite a bit of movement. In the easy runs, in terms of fluctuation, we generally don't see too much fluctuation, but we do see a gap difference. So for example, your wrist-based heart rate might be reading 10 to 15, sometimes 20 beats higher or lower consistently than what a chest strap would be. And one common thing I see very often with a lot of my clients using wrist-based heart rate is their runs from day to day. As much as they might look consistent on a graph, there's massive variance. So some days they're running, and it says they're running at 180 beats per minute for an easy run. The next day they're running at 130 beats per minute. So there are massive variances. There's no consistency to that. the chest strap is always going to be the gold standard. And if you are someone who's very data driven and really wants to be focusing on things like heart rate metrics, you have to have a chest strap for us to take anything out of it and really be analyzing that closely in your training.
Yep, I agree wholeheartedly. And sorry, just with a lot of our international clients, actually, I've seen as well. I mean, obviously, we're in South Africa, we're in warm environments, but a lot of our international clients, our Northern Hemisphere clients, will see a marked difference in that wrist base because of the cold, right? Because your body is keeping all the blood in circulation around the organs to keep it warm, and so you're not getting that same measure. And interestingly enough, just to note, in chatting to our colleague Ntutu, who's on our coaching team, he said that there's also a massive variance for people of color with the optical the sensor. So so definitely not completely accurate. And so chest strap all the way. And then Dev, so I mean, we love data. I mean, we're scientists, we're sports scientists, and we enjoy data, and I know that we have a lot of clients who love data. So and these watches will put out, I mean, vertical oscillation and power and everything. I mean, what do you reckon are the most important metrics? Should they be looking at all of those, or where is the focus there?
Yeah, so I was chatting to Lindsay a lot. He's got a really cool saying. Now I might actually get it wrong, but I think it's analysis paralysis. Yes. So we get so focused on numbers and data and all sorts of things. You talk about vertical oscillation, all sorts of things. That stuff scares me just thinking about those numbers, because again, we're taking away from actually what we're trying to achieve in that training session. Very often we've forgotten about just the perceived effort, and can we have a chat to our mate that we're running with? We're so focused on what the stride count is giving us and all that. Metrics are there, metrics are good. I'm not saying you've wasted all your money buying these fancy devices. That's by no means. I'm a gadget freak. I mean, I love them as well, but everything has to be set up correctly. It has to correlate. So the main metrics we like to focus on is pace, heart rate, and then, as I said, your default being that perceived effort. But what really is important is that all of those speak the same language and correlate. So a common question, and you might have seen it in your training, is you tell me I'm running an easy run based on my threshold pace, and I'm running my easy run, but my heart rate tells me I'm running in zone 5. Now, the only reason that could be is because your zones haven't been set up correctly for you as the individual, not the default settings that your device comes with. So if you have a naturally high heart rate, nothing wrong with that, but your heart rate might be higher than the 220 minus age algorithm that your device generally uses. And now it's automatically pushing you into a higher training zone. So it needs to be set up. If you're doing that threshold test, what is your threshold pace? What is your threshold heart rate? And work at the percentages of threshold for a zone 2 easy run, for example. So that when you're getting out, your perceived effort that feels easy still sits into the same pace range you're trying to achieve and gives you the same response, heart rate response. And if those three are all speaking the same language, you generally right and you're on the right track, and fantastic. Use metrics, and that's a good way to be using those metrics. So by no means am I trying to scare anyone away from it. Just make sure that things are set up properly, calculated properly, and then use them in the correct measure, but not one metric standing alone in isolation. Everything should correlate the whole time.
Talk to each other. I love that. One of the things I like to say about metrics is just because we can measure it doesn't always mean it's valuable as well, So, and actually, just a quick side story. I had a friend the other day. I asked her, I was like, "How did you sleep?" And she literally went and looked at her watch and went, "Yeah, good." And I was like, "Okay, but how did you sleep? Not your watch." But anyway, so aside from that, we're moving away from what we're talking about. We're talking about the long run. And so what Dev is saying is take those metrics and make sure that those metrics are guiding you to tell you that you're running that long run at the correct pace, because we don't want to be running that long run too fast at all. Dev, the golden question that we always get asked is, how long should their longest run be? If you're running the Two Oceans Half Marathon, how long should your longest run be? And normally that's what, 3 or 4 weeks out? No? You can tell me how long, where that should fit in the plan as well.
Yeah, so as sports scientists, people hate us because we tell them it depends, and it very often comes up. Look, for the half distance, yes, about 3 weeks, maybe 4 weeks out. Usually, the longer distances will try and push that long run a little bit earlier. But for the half distance, we're talking 3, maybe 4 weeks out from race day, and we like to prescribe according to time. So it's really important. We won't tell you to go out necessarily and run a 25K run or an 18K run. We're going to tell you to run a 2-hour run or a 2:30 run or a 2:45 run. So focusing on the time rather than the distance. I already mentioned the perceived effort might differ from day to day in terms of pace. So again, if I'm running easy today, I might run my 2 hours, I might run 15 kilometers. And tomorrow, if I was running 2 hours, I might run 17 kilometers. So that's really why we don't like to tell you go and run a certain distance, but run a certain duration. And the importance here is we're trying to get the body to handle time under load. So time under a particular stress. You and I are different runners, for example. So if I say to you, go and run 2 hours and I go and run 2 hours, you naturally, your easy run being relative to you is still going to cover more distance than it is for me. So we then talking completely different durations. And that's why it's more important to say, okay, Shona and Dev, go and run a 2-hour run. Then you run the relative intensity, but you're covering the same time under load, if that makes any sense. Not that you should be comparing yourself to anyone. That's not what I'm saying. But it's the time we put in the body under to achieve the goal and the desired outcome for each of those sessions. Time is for us personally more important than what it is trying to prescribe on distance.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I know Ntutu also always refers to the fact that if you have a 10K route, we're runners, we're competitive. I know I'm going to go and try and run that route faster the next time I run it, just because I'm competitive. So again, that time aspect just takes that out of it. Absolutely.
Or run around the car park 3 or 4 times just to tick off 10Ks because your watch finished on 9.77.
I know. Runners, we are a ridiculous breed, that is for sure. So Dev, okay, so yes, we're prescribing to time, but what would the longest run sort of look like in terms of time? Towards the end of the plan.
So it will be taking into account what level of runner you're at, one, your training history. So again, coming into how much training you've done for this. These long runs, again, we're talking about what the peak long run is going to be later in the plan. So this isn't saying what your long run now already should be. Typically, if you're on I think it's a 120 or a 130 type runner, half marathon time, you probably going to look at your longest run being around 2 hours. And that's the longest run at the peak of the block.
Yes.
If you are slower, so 2:30, 2:45, maybe even a 3-hour runner, you are looking at your longest run being about 2 hours 45 in the training block. Again, it's not ultimately about how long that long run is. It's about the accumulative volume that you're putting in. So there's kind of two sides to the question that we often get here is, am I running long enough in these sessions? And people are worried that they're not running a half marathon distance before their half marathon. My argument is always like, well, if Two Oceans Half is going to be your first half marathon, then why would you run a half marathon before that? Because that's going to be your first. So,
exactly.
So that's really important. It's about the accumulative volume that you're putting in, week out, that's then building up to that distance. So yeah, really important there. And again, those will vary with the kind of hilly undulation type of routes as well. Again, distances might vary, and that's why we're coming down to time necessarily and the amount of time you're spending on the legs in the longest run.
Yeah. Excellent. And so the other side of that coin that you mentioned there is, some people want to make sure they're running the distance, in their long runs, but other people then have questioned us as to go, well, why am I running a long run that is essentially, if I'm a 2 hour 30 half marathoner and that's my goal, why am I doing a 2 hour 45 long run? What's the reason for that?
Yeah. So look, there's still, physiologically speaking, we need a minimum amount of load or training to achieve aerobic capacity in that. So I could get you to be running only hour-long runs, and that's fine, but we're not quite breaking that barrier for you to really be building that aerobic capacity. So there is a minimum amount of volume that needs to be done. Those longer runs do allow us, I talk about that accumulative volume, those longer runs do allow us to build more accumulation week in and week out. But the long runs, and in particular, those sort of durations, is not really about covering that distance. Remember, these are your long runs, so they're a much slower pace. They're nowhere near your race pace. So you aren't going to necessarily be covering 21 Ks in that 2 hour 45 long run, especially if you are a 2:30 runner. If you on the faster end of the scale, then I'm getting you to do a 2 hour long run, you are definitely going to be covering that distance. But again, you're running them slowly, relatively speaking, or easy. But it's really about, these runs are about time on the legs. So we conditioning your body to be able to, one, handle the amount of time that you're spending on the legs. There's a massive mental component to this. So mental resilience, just how to tough it out for that long, how to hurt, if you want to call it that. Not that I'm saying you should be hurting in the long runs. I feel like that's contradicting everything we're saying. But how to go through that amount of time, get your feeding right, playing around with nutrition. And nutrition is a massive aspect, and we are going to touch on nutrition in a lot more depth later on. But these long runs are a really good opportunity for you to be playing around and honing in your nutrition strategies, what works, what doesn't, how much to take in, those sort of things. So it's about adapting, or the adaptation on your ligaments and your tendons that fortifies your structures and your joints and all that, to be able to handle come race day when you have got a longer duration to run and you are actually running it at a higher intensity now as well.
Awesome. Yeah. I mean, I think that's spot on. And so, guys, I really hope that we've covered everything that you need to know about the long run. We will definitely be touching on some more aspects on this as we go along in the next 10 or 9 weeks as we go from here. But I think just the key points is that you don't need to be bleeding from your eyeballs when you're doing these long runs. Okay. So, maybe have another listen to this when you're on your long run, and it'll be a good reminder for you, and share it with your running mates, share it in your running communities and WhatsApp groups, please. And if you have questions, guys, post them in at the bottom in the comments there, and hopefully we can start taking a couple of questions in some time to come as well, and see if we can get those answered for you. But for now, Coach Dev, thanks so much. Really great to have you. And guys, we'll see you all again next week.
Cheers, everyone.